Now, just wanted to remind you all that you can donate at uc-2020.com. We are supporting charities providing COVID-19 relief efforts and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. They include Inner City Arts, Black Lives Matter, Artists Relief, the Loveland Foundation, Doctors Without Borders, MBK Alliance, World Central Kitchen, House of Ruth, and Black Visions Collective. We have a code for the digital care package for the upcoming segment with Karen Rosenkranz. You can find that by clicking on her bio on our website, and the password is City Quitters, CITYQUITTERS. Eugene's going to give us a little bit more about Karen's background.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for this. I did an interview with Karen a few months ago, and it was honestly one of the most enlightening interviews that I've done in recent times, because she really provided insight.
Sorry, more technical difficulties.
Yeah, so she provided a lot of insight into sort of the movement of people moving away from cities into small towns, and sort of the output and the psychological impact that has when you just have less financial pressure on you. So Karen's based in London. She's a trend forecaster, ethnographer, and author specializing in uncovering cultural changes to help clients design for the future. She spots shifts in behaviors, attitudes, and aesthetics. Her work ranges from big picture social trends to detailed color and material forecasts. And in her book, City Quitters, which Charisse just had up, it talks about what life is in sort of a rural setting and what it's like today with all the joys and challenges. And she provides a fresh look at the people and scenes thriving outside urban spaces, as the book gives insight into the lives of 22 people from 12 countries and 5 continents, all based in places with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. Karen continues to explore how people create and work today, looking at changing definitions of success and new values emerging out of the current crisis. So we're excited to have Karen talking with us today about city quitting, and let's go over to Karen.
Hello. Hello from London. It's 1:30.
Don't have.
Sorry, go ahead.
Wait, sorry, I don't actually have audio for you right now. I can't hear you, but I'm going to let you go ahead and get started with your presentation while I troubleshoot audio on my side. So sorry, Karen. Please go ahead.
Okay, no worries. Well, it's 1:30 in the morning, but I'm very excited to be part of this event. I'm going to talk today about my book, City Quitters, which portrays creatives who move from the city to the countryside. And I'm going to share a couple of stories from the book with you, and also how the idea came about and the process of making it. I will also then afterwards, in conversation with Charisse, reflect on what this idea of post-urban life might mean in the context of the current pandemic, and how I think this trend will develop. Eugene already gave a great introduction, but just a bit more about myself. My background is in product design, and I'm a trend forecaster and ethnographer. And so I research cultural trends and design trends, and I help clients to understand new tendencies in people's behaviors and attitudes and in culture, and how to translate that into design or brand strategy. So I work either with consumer insight teams directly with companies, or design agencies, and also in trend forecasting services. And the observation of an emerging trend or an emerging new attitude was also what inspired me to make this book. It started a couple of years ago when a friend of mine, an amazing photographer called Stephen Gill, suddenly moved from East London to rural Sweden. And I was really surprised because his work to me was so inspired by urban life and the kind of really gritty sides of London. And I was just curious how his work is going to develop once he is in this new environment. And then I started slowly to see more friends doing the same thing. And they all left with the idea to protect their work or their creativity. It wasn't so much like, until then, I thought people move out of the city when they have a family and want a bit more quiet life, or they might move to the suburbs. But this was something new, that people were doing it for their work and for their creative kind of output. And another thing was that I was a bit frustrated with the portrayal of rural life in the media, which was overly romanticized and very nostalgic, and always had this very idealized concept of nature, especially on social media as well. And I thought there's an opportunity to challenge that, and not only visually, but also in terms of the narrative, kind of what are the challenges that people come up against, and yeah, what is life really like once you take that step. So I began to interview people with a focus on people in creative fields, and entrepreneurs, so people who set up a small business in rural locations. And I ended up with a collection of 22 stories across 12 countries, spread across 5 continents. And all of these people were based in places with fewer than 10,000 inhabitants, and they all have lived in big cities before. So the first story that I want to share with you today is from Hannah and Carla. They're 2 chefs and artists, and they moved from New York City to Hudson in upstate New York. And they didn't move because of the beautiful landscape that you can find in that area, but because of the community. And this quote from Hannah is really telling. The community in Hudson is all doers, whereas my community in New York was full of planners or talkers. And Hannah said that in a city, people had to work 3 jobs to pay the rent. They had never had any free time to collaborate on other projects or to experiment on projects. And they found the community in Hudson to be very collaborative, because people just had a little less financial pressure and more time to kind of help each other out. So they were also able to fulfill their dream and open a restaurant, which is called Little Depths Oasis. And they did that from signing the lease to on the place to opening the restaurant. They did that within 4 months, and opened the restaurant without any debt or investors, just with help from the community. So they had these kind of bartering deals going on, where they would cook for people and they would come in for a day and help out. Yeah, so they said this would have never been possible in New York City. And I also really love the aesthetic of their restaurant, which has this really fresh tropical vibe. So also something you wouldn't necessarily expect in a rural location. So they were really able to combine also their 2 practices, or their 2 passions of food and art, into this restaurant, because the restaurant is also a platform for performances. They do a lot of events in there and exhibitions. They're really active in the LGBTQ scene in Hudson, and lots of their staff are also artists. So they provide a platform for them to share all that in one space. The next story is quite a different one. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. It's about living in, back. Sorry. Living in nature in a more harmonious way and in a mutually beneficial way. So this is Lynn, and she went through quite a radical transformation. She had this kind of typical agency party life, working 200%, deadline after deadline, and she gradually started to change that, and was frustrated with that lifestyle. So she started to research more about food production, things like permaculture or the circular economy, and she was more and more rejecting the consumerist culture she was also part of. So she decided if she wants to do things properly and to be true to her values, she really needs to do it by herself. So she sold up her apartment in Amsterdam and set off alone in a van just with her dog, not quite sure where she ended up. And she settled in central Portugal in a very deep populated area where she built a simple house and where she lived off the grid. And she only found out after she had bought a piece of land there that there's already a really big eco-minded community in that area. And they've all been very supportive of her vision as well. So her idea is to build a test and demo ground for the topics of food, shelter, and well-being, and all within a circular economy. And she has also, with that group of people, set up a massive rewilding project in the area, to bring back more biodiversity to the place. And she's holding workshops there so people can experience also this life for themselves. And she's really keen to kind of redefine what luxury means. I mean, in her case, it's also, of course, having access to beautiful nature and landscape, clean air and clean water, but also this kind of this sense of freedom and independence and being able to detach yourself from societal expectations. So also the way she works is very free and very intuitively guided and not guided by deadlines as it was previously. The last story is based on the Mediterranean island of Sardinia. This is Kyre and Ivano. Kyre grew up in California, and she worked as a fashion and set designer, in fashion, not as a fashion designer, and set designer in New York. Ivano was born in Milan, and he comes from the world of graffiti and contemporary art. And they're two very metropolitan-minded people, and their friends were really shocked when they decided to quit the city and said, oh, you're never going to survive there, you know, you're going to be so bored. But they said they really needed a break and have more space and time to calm their minds. And they have dedicated themselves to bringing the wealth of ancient crafts that still exist on the island of Sardinia to a contemporary audience. So they work with a lot of local artisans like shoemakers, people in pottery, carpentry, textiles, and there's a lot of amazing old techniques still present that are typical for the area, and they work and reinterpret them in a modern way. Their studio's called Perez-Gallardo, and they really found a way to blend their urban experiences with the rural and mix the old with the modern and create something new and fresh out of this. On the next page, there's a great quote by Ivano, who says, cities are contemporary ghettos. I don't think you can grow as a human being if you're not talking to people that are different to you. And this is a really important sentiment that all of the people I spoke to mentioned, this idea of getting out of your bubble, because we always, I mean, of course, cities are very diverse, but we usually operate in this very, in these bubbles of just like-minded people, and we all have the same taste, we share the same views, same opinions. So this might seem scary when you move out of the city to a smaller town, but all of the people said it's actually quite refreshing and grounding to just speak to people with different backgrounds, different views. It's not always easy. It can be challenging and confronting, but it's actually a very healthy thing to be doing. And for those two, being in this new environment also really enables them to find their own voice. They've been able to develop their own aesthetic without being constantly distracted by what everybody else is doing. And it also gave them an opportunity to balance their creative work, which happens mostly on laptops, with physical work like planting olive trees or building a dry stone wall, which they've been working on for a while. So I think this gives you a little insight into the book. And if you go to the next slide, I think the last one now. Thank you, yeah. So you see, these are three very different stories. And just to summarize, to give you a bit of an overview of the other stories that are in the book, what are the main themes or the main motivations for people to leave the city? And they can be summarized under four kind of overarching topics, which are space, time, nature, and community. And apart from the last one, all these are very scarce and expensive commodities in big cities, but are abundant in the countryside. So space is obviously about, having more affordable space, maybe having a studio space. Depending on what your practice is, you might need a bigger physical space to produce work, to experiment. Also have access to less crowded landscapes, and also a little bit escape the monoculture and this kind of sameness that we see a bit in cities. There's a certain level of cultural saturation. So if you get out of that, you just get also more headspace to think of new and more original ideas maybe. time. So with less financial pressure, you hopefully have also a better work-life balance. You can slow down a bit, decelerate, and have more time for reflection and critical thinking, and also maybe be bored a little bit. It's, I think, something we're fighting so hard not to be, but it's actually essential for creative work. And nature is kind of an obvious one. People have always moved out of the city to be closer to nature. But I think especially now there's a growing desire to reconnect with nature, and maybe also during lockdown, people have engaged with nature in the new world and appreciate also the benefits it brings for mental health, for example. And some of the people in my book also work directly with nature in natural resources. So with food, there's a couple in Oregon who work with forage ingredients, or other people who use the plants as ingredients in a skincare product. So it could also be a literal ingredient. And nature can also be a kind of guidance in terms of establishing a more healthy work rhythm. So you're more guided by the seasons and times of days, which we often forget completely in cities. And last one, community, maybe the most important one. People are able to organize themselves in smaller structures, collaborate more. There's a greater sense of autonomy and self-sufficiency, and people can really try out like different models of working and living together. There's currently, I see a lot of communal living concepts emerge in the countryside, which is super exciting. And it's also an opportunity to engage with the local community, with what is already there, and build bridges with these two different worlds, and make cultural work more accessible and bring it maybe to new audiences. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an overview of the book.
Thank you.
As Cherie said, these pages are also part of the digital care package, so you can also read the interviews at your leisure.
Thank you so much for going through these three very different stories, and also highlighting the main concepts in your book. And one thing interesting is that the book was published in 2018, so 2 years ago. And your job as a trend forecaster is to identify trends, emerging trends and people's attitudes, like before they become mainstream, right? But since the publication has been out for, and I was wondering if you've been continuing to observe city quitting and where you've seen it going.
I think the rural has definitely become part of the wider cultural conversation, and not just city quitting, but also just rural areas in general. And I want to stress that there are amazing projects in the initiatives in the countryside from people who never lived in the cities. I'm not suggesting that culture needs to be imported from cities, not at all. But it's definitely becoming a bigger theme now. And there's, for example, a big exhibition at the moment at the Guggenheim in New York, which is called Countryside: The Future by Rem Koolhaas and AMO, his research practice. So I think there's a growing interest in the rural, and I think there's also a shift away from this binary idea that urban is progressive and the rural is conservative. I think that's no longer true. And I think increasingly we'll see the countryside as the place also where culture is created, and a very dynamic space as well, maybe also to experiment with more radical ideas. And I think also we see more hybrid models where people combine cultural creative work and physical agricultural work. So for example, working on their laptops on a creative brief, but then also working on the land and growing food, and kind of combining these two things in new ways.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you said about the definition of our terms and concepts. So it's just like the associations that we've always made with these words are kind of breaking down and rethinking themselves. And then I want to ask you, even more specifically, not just in the 2 years, but then in light of the last couple months with the COVID-19 pandemic, have you seen more people discussing it as like this very kind of pressing, important thing for them? One thing I told you when I was reading these stories is that, I think my response now is so different from 6 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, while it's been a growing trend for a while, the pandemic has definitely amplified the desire to leave the cities. I mean, for a lot of people. And I know, I mean, I read reports that searches for properties outside of cities are going up massively. I also anecdotally know of some people I'm in touch with that there have been a lot of requests. And it just had, I think the crisis has brought many problems to the fore that we have in cities, that they're overcrowded. Like density is, of course, a major problem in a virus situation. They're overpriced, they're polluted. The healthcare system is more easily overwhelmed. But it has also made us more aware of the things that enable a life away from the city. Things like remote working. I mean, this has been a huge test for so many more people that have not worked remotely before. It's become more mainstream, more employers can now imagine to allow this, at least partially. And of course, social media and the internet, we can feel connected and be part of something like this event, for example, also when we're physically apart. And yes, that was there before, but I think now it's become clearer to people that we can engage with culture wherever we are. And so, yeah, I think as tragic and as terrible as this pandemic is for so many people around the world, it also has created this opportunity, like a window for ideas that have been waiting to happen to emerge more fully and maybe be embraced by a broader public. So in terms of city quitting, I think for people that have already entertained the thought, I think it just might just give them the final nudge to actually do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is maybe a way to talk about it is that the pandemic, as you've said, just exposed things that were pre-existing. So whether those things were negative, things within our system that are broken, or positive, things such as like being able to do remote work, it's just that those things have been kind of brought to light over the past months. In general, a little bit away from city quitting specifically, but because it is, you are well versed in ethnography and just like observing how people are emotionally responding and then how that translates into decision making. What do you kind of expect people to be doing as a result of like their new emotions from these last couple of years? Like, how do you sort of look at the year ahead?
Well, I think a major point is that people have now really had the chance to reassess their priority. I think this enforced pause has enabled, if it was a pause, I'm totally aware that many people didn't have a pause at all, but if you were lucky enough to have a break now, I think people could really take stock of what is important. And I think many people do like their decelerated lives, realize actually what I had planned was a bit crazy. What I was trying to do was a bit too much. And many people enjoy better work-life balance, maybe seeing their family more. They enjoy a more simpler, the simple pleasures, the simple interactions, and also consuming less. So I think it's been a really humbling experience that made people more grateful for what they have. So maybe they also realize what I have is enough. Maybe I don't need to chase this next level, next big thing. Maybe where I am is actually fine. And I think it will also make people look at what success is in a new way, especially in creative industries where we tend to glorify this hustle culture and working constantly. And I think more people will now come to question that.
Yeah, I mean, just personally, that really resonates with my own conversations I've had with peers. I think it's something I just want to acknowledge, which I think is kind of funny, is that, you're calling in from London and I'm calling in from Hong Kong, which are two of the largest global cities. And yet we're talking about your book titled City Quitters and this idea of city quitting. And I think I wanted to talk more about, what people are moving towards, not just what they're leaving behind. And you said one of the things is this adjustment to nature and rural areas. So do you think you could expand on that a little bit more?
I think we just crave nature more, also because of our digitally saturated lifestyle. If you spend the whole day in front of Zoom calls, you can really do with being outdoors for a while to kind of balance that out a little bit. And there's been a huge surge in interest in nature topics, like people listening to more podcasts about, astronomy, the plants that grow locally, bird watching, and it's probably the first time people engage with nature more deeply. And I think the benefits it has for mental health are just so huge. And I think it's really, I don't know, it can alleviate so much anxiety. So I think it's something that people really crave. And I think so. People are also in a kind of anticipation of maybe further lockdowns or even future pandemics, are now looking for places where they feel a bit less confined and less anxious.
Yeah. One thing, just what you were saying reminded me, as I think in the interview with Ivano and Kyre, they say how, if it's 45 degrees Celsius, you just physically can't do any work, and so it's this idea of when you're really in touch with nature and rural, your rhythm also changes. And it just was making me think about like the artificiality of the rhythm we have when we sit indoors in air-conditioned rooms. So last question for you before we move to Q&A from the audience. And this is a kind of broad, open question and is very personal, I think, but I was wondering, besides like observing external trends, personally, what hopes do you have for the future? And is there a direction that you want to see people move in?
Yeah, that's a big question. But I think if this pandemic has taught us anything, is that we need each other. The relationships we have, the communities we build are the most important thing. And in terms of quitting the city, I just hope to see more community-minded projects where people find new ways to, also work together, live together with people of different ages, different backgrounds, and kind of build a bridge between these two worlds. So that also means, like I said, this kind of idea of stepping out of your bubble of like-mindedness and out of your comfort zone. And one thing that might hold people back is the perception that provincial areas are less diverse and also maybe rife with right-wing ideology. But, I don't want to generalize. Many communities aren't like that at all. But I realize it can present a problem. So it does take courage. But I think we really, we have to reach out. We have to try and engage with people that are different to us and become a bit less tribal. If we just operate within our own circles, our own groups, we never change anything, or, we never bring people closer together. And I also hope for young people who are maybe listening and just starting out in their creative careers, that they realize they don't necessarily need to be in big cities. They don't need to sacrifice quality of life. They can be part of the conversation wherever they are.
Thank you. Stay with us. We're going to transition to Q&A from Okay, so our first question is coming from George, and this is from Los Angeles. This person asks, based on your ethnographic research, how can communities thrive in ways that are less traditional? How might this impact sustainability in urban systems?
In urban? Sorry.
Yes, how might this impact sustainability in urban systems?
I don't know. I think, for example, I'm planning a documentary actually on this topic as well, and I'm still casting for stories. And I came across this project in Germany where artists are building a residency, and they were driven out of Berlin because it was too expensive. They wanted more space, but they also really have this idea in mind that they want to involve the local community. So I think it's that kind of thinking. They're also planting food. They're doing art. They're having residencies, but they also invite the local people who live there and really engage them. So I think these kind of concepts that are like merging, different ideas and kind of, yeah, bringing different communities together are really, are really important.
Okay, this next question comes from Yong Ray in Singapore. And the question is, what are some works that has led or inspired you to new ways of thinking to help you make new connections and incite cultural change? So the question is, what are some, so I think it's asking, you know, what do you look at? Like, what is your habits of, well, my spin on this is like, what are your habits of reading or observing other people and cultural materials? And I mean, you mentioned the Guggenheim exhibit.
Yeah, I think before the pandemic, it was a lot of going out in London and just being out observing people, going to exhibitions, and that's all of that. But I think also just a lot of cultural exploration now happens online. I think. I mean, I got in touch with Eugene through Instagram, and that happened. So I think a lot of these things now happen online, although of course you have to be careful that again you're in your own bubble and you know it's not the real world, social media. So I think exhibitions, I mean in London we're really spoiled, so but also I'm more and more excited by stories I hear from that are not from cities, that you know, like this project I just mentioned in Germany that people are doing and they're not in cities.
Well, I was just going to do a part 2 on that question. I'm wondering, is there anything, you know, you mentioned you hope that young people will be inspired to reconsider, you know, that their creative careers don't have to be in big cities. Is there like reading material or somewhere that you would encourage young people to kind of look that sort of way of thinking?
There's a great website called Lecture in Progress, a London-based website. It's part of, as an often of its NICET. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but they are especially tailored to young and emerging creatives. I think that's a great resource. And I don't know, just reach out to people in your area and what, you know, like there's so many little creative hubs emerging now in smaller cities, and I don't mean, you know, like completely in the countryside, but smaller towns, smaller villages that also have really amazing stuff happening. So I don't know, now with all these restrictions, we just have to be a bit more creative and look what is available in our immediate surroundings. Yeah,
I like that. There's no one answer that fits all, right? So we have one last question from our audience, and this is from Lila in Boston. And they ask, what were some of the biggest surprises that emerged from your research?
Good question. I don't know how the many different ways you can make this work. And, you know, I don't know, there's not one way to kind of do this. And, you know, it's also something I'm thinking about, you know, should I do this and how would I do this? But there's so, I don't know, it's really, I think for most people, I found it's really liberating. It seems like a scary big step, but most people who do it are really then free to think in new ways and new directions, come up with new projects and brands, and yeah, it's just really, really exciting. But it seems like I don't know, from a city perspective, it seems like a big, brave step. But yeah, I think it can be really transformative.
I wonder if I can kind of read the question and ask, you know, before and put the book together, did you have these kind of expectations from the interviews? And then when you were really into it, did you feel like actually those expectations, you know, these are not the answers I thought I was going to get? I
really couldn't hear you very well.
Sorry.
Can you repeat your question?
Yes. I was saying, I was wondering if I could kind of rephrase that question and ask you, before you even started doing the research on this book and putting it together, did you have expectations that were then you you didn't know that you were going to find?
Yeah, I think I didn't think that I would find so many amazing projects. I thought maybe this was just starting out and was just happening. And yeah, I found that, you know, in the beginning it was a lot more work to find these people, but now it's just more and more people doing it. But it wasn't so much that I found something, oh, I didn't expect it, but it almost like I didn't expect it to be so amazing and to be such great projects out there, and yeah, so creative. So it was more that I found, yeah, projects that are really, really cool. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kyre. Shout out your book. I have it with me, which is, you know, very happy to hold it in my hand. Where can they find City Quitters, Karen, if they're interested?
They can buy it on the publisher's website, which is Frame. That's the best way to buy it directly. They're based in Amsterdam. I'm in Europe, but it's also available on Amazon and in many bookstores. I think at the Guggenheim they have it as well.
Oh, the Guggenheim's great if you are able to access the Guggenheim. But yes,
yeah,
Frame.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, Karen, we're really happy that you were able to tune in so late at night in London in particular.
Thank you so much to Eugene and you both and everybody who put this together. It's been a pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.